One of the greatest things about mythology is that it not only has an overall collective meaning, but it also has very open ends for personal interpretation and for you to personally and individually connect with it. So for me, one of my most connected mythological motifs is the Green Man. And my entire house is littered with images and motifs of the Green Man. People found out that I really enjoyed the Green Man motif, and so year after year after year, I get gift after gift after gift of all these wonderful little trinkets that litter my entire house. And I like to incorporate them in with the foliage. I have plants all over my house too. But all sorts of wonderful little images of the Green Man all over my home, from candles to individually made items. Like this one, for instance, is a coffee mug that I drink my coffee from every single morning. It was gifted to me by a friend who, a friend of his, made this for a Renaissance fair. And she made a ton of these. She is also the same one who made these little ashtrays, and I have a dozen of these littering my house. Also, she made this fantastic little Green Man image as well. Supposed to have a clock, I've never gotten around to putting it all together. Then significant people in my life give me all sorts of these little things when they find them at gift shops, at bookstores, and so forth. So my entire house is Green Man oriented, but I am far from the only person who's found such a deep and meaningful connection with the Green Man motif. All over the world, we see every culture seemingly littered with this exact same motif, and that is where my interest began to be piqued.
We find the Green Man image and motif scattered all throughout history and all over the world. All over Europe, especially, we find pubs and hotels named the Green Man. Ancient reliefs put into architecture and so forth, scattered everywhere. But even in America, you cannot walk down the street in an old city without finding a Green Man motif put into the architecture, put into a stained glass mural, or referenced in some way, shape, or form. Even our modern times have latched onto the Green Man motif and kept it alive and flourishing. Even our local brewery that I frequent has a Green Man beer and Green Man images scattered all over the place, and this is in small town Midwest America. To put it shortly and briefly, this is perhaps one of the most commonly found motifs and images of all human history. The earliest Green Man relief and architecture that we find comes to us in the ruins of Hatra in modern-day Iraq, and this comes from the 2nd century AD. This is typically what we think of when we conjure up the idea of the Green Man. And from this point, which we don't exactly know where this motif came from or why it was featured in the architecture, but from this point forward, it seems to explode onto the world scene, and from 2nd century onwards is found everywhere in populated areas.
Traditionally, we have three types of Green Man images or motifs. The first one that we find is called the foliate head, and that is where the entire face, the entire head, is covered in sticks and leaves and various types of vegetation. The second type is the disgorging head, and this is where vegetation is spewing from the mouth, so to speak. And the third one, oddly enough, is called the bloodsucker head, and this is where foliage is growing from all the orifices of the body, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth. And these are the three most common motifs of the Green Man that we find in all of art, all of literature, all of architecture, everywhere throughout the world. Even today, we find this Green Man image and motif to be extremely relatable. It's very familiar to us, and it talks to us on a seemingly instinctual level. There's something homey about it. There's something that we can relate to and connect to on an extremely human level. In other words, there's something innately natural about it. But why exactly do we see this motif and image arising again and again and again throughout all of human history? That is the question that we now have to ask, and the answers, I think, will be absolutely surprising to most people. The reality is that the Green Man image and motif can be traced back to our absolutely earliest mythological ideas. That when we look back at the earliest known deities and mythos phenomenon in human history, we find that the spirits, the deities, the gods and goddesses, in other words, were all nature oriented. They were land spirits, in other words. They were spirits of the wood, spirits of the trees, spirits of the rivers, spirits of the mountains, spirits of the skies, even. And this can be traced back to even earlier than humanity. For instance, we do know that the Neanderthals had a sort of mythological belief. They didn't have a religion per se, but they had mythological ideas. And this can be reflected and represented in vague archaeological finds concerning Neanderthals. I'll do a video on that at a later date. But they certainly lived in accordance with nature. So we don't exactly know what the Neanderthal deities were, but we would suspect that they themselves were nature-oriented. And then we see a later evolution into when people were people and how we consider them in our modern context. And at that point, we do know, verifiably, that the earliest deities were nature deities. These were tree gods and goddesses. These were forest gods and goddesses, nymphs, spirits, sprites, in other words. The most popular early deity, which represents nature deities, is Cernunnos or Cernunnos. A lot of people are in heavy debate on how to pronounce the name. We'll get more into the name here in a moment. But this is become an icon and almost synonymous with the Green Man, because Cernunnos, or Cernunnos, depending on how you want to pronounce it, is the earliest and most popular aspect of the Green Man. It is the embodiment of all of the earliest deities. The earliest deities being known as fertility gods, gods of the hunt, gods of the forest, lords of the woods, so to speak. And they're shown usually in contrast with animals and to be horned or antlered deities. Their characteristics are usually very woodland oriented, and they of course have this wild aspect to them where they have protruding antlers out of their head, and they seem to represent something primordial, something very wild, something very fierce and ferocious, in other words. And that is where we find the earliest Green Man motif, or image, in other words.
The name Cernunnos, paired with the horned nature deity, comes to us only in one instance, and that is the Pillar of the Boatman, constructed in Lutetia, modern-day Paris, in the 1st century CE. It shows Cernunnos, the horned deity of nature, sitting cross-legged. Almost everything in this pillar was written in Latin. However, there was some Gaulish mixed in with it. Not to mention the fact that there are pagan Celtic gods mixed with Roman gods. This pillar was badly damaged, but although the bottom half is gone, it seems that Cernunnos, or Cernunnos if you will, is featured sitting cross-legged and seemingly holding a torque. A torque is significant because in Celtic culture this was a symbol of power and authority. He also seems to be holding something else. However, this has been left up to debate and speculation. A lot of people believe that it was another torque that he was holding. Some people hold to the idea that it was a purse or even a cornucopia, representing his fruitility and his aspects of divine reproduction. I propose, though, that it was more than likely an animal. Some sort of animal, more than likely a snake. But this monument links the name Cernunnos or Cernunnos with the image that we hold dear to of the horned nature deity, which has become synonymous with the Green Man in our modern world. The most popular image of Cernunnos, though, comes to us in the form of the Gundestrup cauldron. This was found in Denmark in a bog, and it was made roughly 200 to 100 BCE. There is an extremely significant debate, though, raging on into our modern day as to where this cauldron was made and how and why it ended up in Denmark. It was thought for a long time to have been made in modern-day Britain. Then it became theorized that it must have came from France. and for a while it was an extremely trendy ideology to correlate it to the Middle East, very specifically Turkey. Then, of course, there is always those who try to connect it to modern-day Germany, saying that it came from the Teutonic tribes. And now it is likely thought to have been made in the Balkans. But there is a growing trend leading to the idea that it might have actually come from Denmark itself. On this fantastic cauldron, we see various images which kindle the most mysterious phenomenon in the modern imagination. We see images of death and resurrection. We see what appears to be mythological motifs that have now been lost to us, and there also seems to be very shamanic aspects. But most importantly, we see Cernunnos in his most stereotypical and cliche form. We see Cernunnos, the horned nature deity, sitting with a snake in one hand and a torque in the other, representing his power over life and death, rebirth, knowledge, wisdom, information. And it also shows a very shamanic quality to Cernunnos. He is sitting cross-legged in what appears to be a yogi style, or a shamanic style. This is interesting to note because nature deities are always heavily associated with shamans, and shamans are very connected to the extra-psychical experience. Joseph Campbell connects them to the schizophrenic break in one's mind, while Terence McKenna connects them to the psychedelic experience. But nonetheless, this scene could also explain why we see such bizarre phenomenon like a man riding a dolphin, for instance, and why we see other bizarre scenes which are very heavily connected to shamanic activities. We also see in this scene various animals, not all of which can be identified, and what seems to be a sort of fungus that is wrapped throughout all the images on this cauldron. This fungus, of course, has been interpreted by many, again, calling back to Terence McKenna, to reference the shamanic aspect, very specifically the psychedelic experience associated with shamanism. Yet the nature aspect found in this cauldron, coupled with the various animals, shows that this deity is extremely connected with wildlife, extremely connected with nature, and he seems to be representing a sort of totem for animals, that he is an animal-type spirit or a protector of the animals. Yet we also have to note that Cernunnos is holding a snake, and snakes are affiliated with countless early deities. In fact, as far as it goes, Maria Gimbutas says that the snake was perhaps one of the earliest mythological motifs and the earliest affiliation with gods and goddesses. The snake represents good luck and a duality, as something that can go between worlds. Of course, this is Maria Gimbutas' interpretation of it. But it seems to have very psychopompic aspects to it, very psychedelic aspects, and of course represents the ideas of death and resurrection.